and we're so happy you could join us here. Our chamber business briefs are meant to be short, free to attend programs designed to connect you with the latest guidance and resources to help you and your organization thrive. So look for business briefs on our website and in our e-news, and the content will always be available for you to refer to again. And just a reminder, if you have any questions during this seminar, there is a Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to type your questions into there, and we'll try to get to as many as possible during the program, or they may already be addressed during the program. Now, remember, this is meant to provide you a broad-based high-level overview. So as with any specific scenario, you're always encouraged to contact your own company's employment law provider. But this morning, we're very excited to have Mikkie Schiltz from Lane Waterman. She's a partner at Lane Waterman. She joined the firm in 2001 and focuses primarily on litigation, education, and employment law. She counsels clients on matters related to employment and education issues, including discrimination, harassment, and contractual obligations. Mikkie is recognized by Chambers USA and America's Leading Lawyers for Business and has a Martindale rating. In 2016, she was inducted into the American Board of Trial Advocates. Mikkie received her BA magna cum laude from the University of West Florida and her JD summa cum laude from the University of Illinois College of Law. Thank you for joining us here today, Mikkie. Please take it away.
Okay. All right, welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share screen while we get started. Let's see, I guess you can see. Let's go. All right, so what you need to know about the COVID-19 vaccine in the workplace. One of the big questions that's out there is whether or not employers can require employees to take the vaccine. And generally, here I'm clicking, it's not going. And generally the rule is yes. The law allows employers to require vaccinations. Does that mean you should require the vaccination? I think that depends. Number one, you should consider if it's necessary for your workforce. Are you in healthcare, for example? Are you in a situation where your employees work closely together and there's no way for them to separate? Are you in a business that provides services to the public, going into people's homes, for example, that type of thing. So generally, yes, but you should look at whether or not your type of business, it makes sense. We'll talk a little bit more about that. For example, I have seen some commentary or articles about, well, I want to require as an employer the vaccine because I want to tell the public that all of my employees are vaccinated. So they'll be encouraged to come to my business and conduct business. Can you do that then for that reason? Well, generally, yes, I guess you can do that because it's necessary for your workplace. However, the reality is probably not your entire workforce is going to be vaccinated, even if you require it, because there are some exceptions. So what are those exceptions if you decide to, yes, require vaccinations? One exception is religion, and the other is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if somebody has a religious exemption to taking a vaccine, or they have a disability that you would need to accommodate, those are some exceptions. In addition, let me just talk briefly. We all know, I'm sure, hopefully, there's tons of press out there. We all know that this vaccine, or all three of the vaccines that are currently approved for use in the United States, are emergency use vaccinations. That means they do not have, at this point, full FDA approval. They're for emergency use only because we're in the middle of the pandemic. That's different than the traditional vaccines of, your polio vaccines, your flu vaccines, even though they change every year, your mumps and measles, your tetanus shots, all of those vaccinations are not emergency use. And it is not uncommon for employers or educators to require vaccinations. It's extremely common for healthcare providers, for example, to require the flu vaccine every year. It's also extremely common for various employers to maybe not require it, but to make it available in their workplace to make it easy for employees to get the vaccine. So let's talk a little bit about the exceptions and what you need to consider if you're going to require the vaccination. So the religious exemption means that an employee can say, I am not going to take the vaccine. I have a religious exemption. What does that mean? That means that the employee has a sincere and closely held religious belief that they cannot take vaccinations for any reason. So then what do you need to do? You need to look at accommodations, just like if they had any type of closely held religious belief. For example, if they have a closely held religious belief that requires them to recognize Saturdays as the Sabbath, can you then require them to work overtime on Saturdays? Maybe not, because you have to accommodate them for that closely held religious belief. Similarly, if they have a closely held religious belief and there's various religious holidays, one accommodation would be allowing them time off on those holidays. So what accommodations, so let me back up. So what do you do? Because obviously a religion that that says you can't take, cannot take vaccinations is not a terribly common anyway religion. What can you ask the employee if they object to the vaccination because of their closely held religious belief? You can ask them, number one, what is your religious belief? And let them tell you what it is. And number two, what is it that taking the vaccination would violate that closely held religious belief? So for example, early on in the pandemic, as we all were starting to wear face coverings and face masks, occasionally I have had employers call me and say, I've got an employee that says that they have a religious objection to the mask wearing. And I'm like, well, that sounds interesting. And I said, well, you have to ask, what is that religious belief? And then consider whether there's any accommodations that you can provide to do that. Well, in the one situation I'm thinking of, I had an employer that, well, interestingly, this employee had already been talking about for years, they'd worked there for years, already talked about that they were an atheist. I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure that that's not a sincerely closely held religious belief of atheists that they can't wear face masks. But I presume maybe there's some religion or belief out there that would, not allow you to wear face masks. So that one was kind of not accommodated at that time. So the more common exemption would be the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in that case, just like any other disability, you analyze it and determine whether or not you provide accommodations. So what is that analysis? Does the person have a disability? If they claim a disability with regard to a work rule or work requirement that they can't meet because of a disability, employers are allowed to ask general questions. What is that disability? And what is it about that disability that indicates you cannot take the vaccination? And in that case, in the case of a vaccination, it probably is going to require some kind of note from a physician. There are disabilities out there, just like there are disabilities with regard to the wearing of face masks. There are disabilities out there that probably prohibit some people from taking the vaccination. Does that mean just because they don't believe in them? No. Just not believing in vaccinations is not a disability. But what if there are medical conditions? The most common one that I'm aware of, I'm not a physician, so don't take this, but the most common, and I know this anecdotally just because of people that I know, there are people that have severe reactions to vaccinations. And it depends on what's in those vaccines, whether or not they're going to have the reaction. So there are people that commonly do not take the flu shot, for example, because they have a condition that they could react. Similar to those types of things that you've seen in the press, where people have had severe allergic reactions, for example, that could be a disability. Allergies in and of themselves can be a disability. There's others that could cause major heart conditions or other types of situations. So you have to analyze that. So with regard to then accommodations, if you are, as an employer, requiring the vaccine, and somebody then has either a disability that would prohibit them from taking the vaccine or a religious exemption from taking the vaccine, you then have to look at accommodations for those employees. So could you accommodate their refusal to have the vaccine? Obviously, most employers now have been dealing with this pandemic for almost a year. So nobody, for the most part, in any of these most locations have been vaccinated. And so what are you requiring of employees with regard to accommodations? What are those accommodations that you could have? One, work from home, because maybe their job allows them to work from home. Number two, it could be continued use of face masks. We all know that out there, anybody that's been vaccinated is being encouraged to still wear still socially distance, still wear face masks. I presume at some point that may change, where we have more herd immunity and such. And if you're vaccinated, they're going to believe that maybe you're not going to be able to spread the disease to others. So that face mask recommendation from the CDC may change. So what then could you do for those individuals that are not vaccinated? You could require them to continue to wear face masks, continue to socially distance, continue not to, for example, use common spaces for their meals, make sure they distance when they have a meal. Lots of employers have break rooms. It could be continuing to use plexiglass. It could be, putting them in a separate office or area away from others. There's a whole host of accommodations. And depending on the environment that you're in and whether you're able to accommodate that, it may or may not be termination. I doubt it would be termination at this point, but we don't know enough about the vaccine enough, or whether or not we're going to get to that herd immunity that everybody has been talking about for nearly a year. So other considerations that you should think about if you're going to require the vaccine would be, number one, employee complaints. It's going to feel like Big Brother to them, whether or not the employer is going to require the vaccine. Public perception and then customer perception. That's sort of what I talked about just a few minutes ago with regard to whether or not, you can then advertise out there, hey, we have a fully vaccinated staff, that kind of thing. Hey, we require it for our employees, so you should shop here. Is that a good perception to have? Let me just say, anecdotally, I have seen stories out there where just recently, because different states have taken different positions as to who gets access to the vaccine first. In New York, apparently, restaurant workers were one of the first phases, and they were allowing employees that were having direct contact with the public to be vaccinated. And I read a story where there was an employer that was requiring all of their employees, the restaurant staff, to get vaccinated. And one of the young employees, as you would expect, a lot of young employees of the wait staff, objected, and just didn't really object, just said, hey, I just need some time to research this. And she got terminated. And she was able to get out there on social media and in articles out there and got a lot of support for her objection to the employer's requirement. So think about whether or not the public perception and the employee perception would place you in a difficult position. And that's going to depend on what kind of location you have. How closely do your people work together? How closely do they work with the public? Whether or not you want to require the vaccination. So I'm going to go over a few questions that I've gotten ahead of time, but if you have questions for me that are specific, and hopefully some people are putting questions in the Q&A, and Erin's going to read those to me. But a few questions that I received ahead of time were, can you maybe not go so far as requiring the vaccination, but maybe encourage the vaccination within your workforce? And what steps can you take to encourage the vaccination? So yes, you can just encourage the vaccination. You shouldn't give something like, major monetary benefits, because there could be some problems with that from some of the Department of Labor might be concerned about those. But you could, for example, if you don't have a large employer, there's lots of large employers that are making the vaccine available and working with healthcare providers to have the healthcare providers come on site and then vaccinate on site during work time. That is certainly an encouragement. So they're getting paid while they're getting vaccinated, and it's easy for them, for employees. If you're not a large employer, that's probably going to be difficult. Most, here in town, Genesis and Unity Point aren't probably going to come out and vaccinate an employer that has 5 employees on site, at least for the foreseeable future. I don't think they come on site to do, 5 flu shots for people. But you could give time off, not just unpaid time off, but you could give them PTO or just paid time off and not have it count against their vacation leave or their PTO in order to encourage them to go and get the vaccine. Because nearly all vaccination appointments that I'm aware of, at least here in the Quad Cities, are during work hours. I know they have some Saturday times in places, but it would be an encouragement to allow employees to take the 2 hours or so that it takes to travel to the location, get ready, get the vaccination, sit there for the period of time, the waiting period that they want to make sure you don't have a reaction, and then get back to work. So giving those 2 hours of paid time off would be an encouragement. You could give some kind of, t-shirt or cup or whatever in order to encourage vaccination. So yes, you could do that. The other question, and it wasn't even one that was submitted, but it's something that I have thought about, is can you require also employees to inform their employer, inform you when they've been vaccinated? And yes, generally, just like other medical information that you gather from employees, especially because we're in a pandemic and you're making decisions about accommodations, you could require employees to inform you if they've been vaccinated. So if you already have employees, for example, that are working in healthcare industry, are over age 65 and eligible in Iowa, working in an essential business, which is different in Illinois and Iowa as to who they're already vaccinating. And if they're doing it on their own, you could have those employees inform you so you can have a list. So you have a good idea about whether or not what accommodations and what public health measures you're going to take within your facility to determine, do I have 75% of my employees vaccinated? Do we need to continue to have mask wearing? Do we need to continue to socially distance? Do we need to continue to have staggered schedules of people arriving? Those types of things. I'm just making sure I have time. So that paid time off issue, I think, is a great encouragement. I think it would encourage a lot of employees, but you could then, if you're going to give them PTO, you certainly could require them to come back and prove that they've been at that appointment, just like you could for any other PTO. So what about side effects? Because a lot of people out there are not getting the vaccine because they're concerned about the side effects and the fact that it's not quite been proven and not been proven for a long period of time. It's the fastest rollout of a vaccine in US and world history. Back in I don't remember, in the 50s and 60s when polio came out, I think it took them something like 4 or 5 years to develop the polio vaccine. So just anecdotally, to have a vaccine within about 9 or 10 months of when this pandemic started, it's record time. So what about paid time off for side effects? That could also be an encouragement. Can you give them special PTO or sick time if they have side effects? Yes, that's an encouragement to get the vaccine. And you can have limitations. I would encourage you to have a policy if you're going to do that, or at least maybe you don't need to put it in your handbook, but you need to publish it, or at least talk to employees about it. You know, hey, we're going to give you 1 or 2 days off if you happen to have whatever, and we just need a doctor's note, or we don't need a doctor's note. Other employers have set up their vaccines, if they're coming in-house that I know of, they'll do them on days so that the side effects aren't going to affect their business too much. So having the vaccine on a Friday, so that those side effects affect our Saturday and Sunday. And so they return on Monday. You know, I have not anecdotally heard of any vaccinations here that have resulted in anything more than that 1 or 2 days for any employees that I'm aware of. So those are the types of things that you can put together for employees. Erin, do we have any other questions, or do you want me to keep going through? You're on mute.
Is that better? Sorry. Here's a question. What type of liability does an employer have if they require the vaccination, but then an employee has a severe reaction or even death?
Okay. Obviously, we haven't heard of any deaths yet that are caused by the vaccine. Anecdotally, there aren't any that I am aware of out there, because I think emergency use authorization may not have been provided if they could have associated any deaths with the vaccine at this point. But could you have liability? Maybe. But I think that it would probably, if you're providing the vaccination in-house and it's part of your work requirement at work and they're being paid for that, I think that your work comp coverage should cover that. And there's certainly going to have to be a causation piece to prove that it was caused by the vaccine, and that it was only a work-related vaccine. I mean, some people would get it anyway. So there's a lot of pieces that go into that. And just separately, because there is already a statute in Iowa, Illinois employers are not as fortunate. There is a liability protection for employers and businesses with regard to contracting the vaccine within the workplace. So would you have more liability because of requiring the vaccine? I don't think the statute in Iowa addresses that. It addresses only COVID, contraction of COVID within the workplace, or, from the business, that there is liability protections as long as you're following government guidelines and regulations with regard to protections in your workplace. So I think more to come. I think that there may be other types of liability protections out there. In addition, I don't know that you would not be the only probably individual on the hook. I mean, it could be the vaccine provider, and the healthcare provider could also have some liability issues if the vaccine actually caused the death. So there's a lot of things that go into that. If it's related to work, did it happen at work? Is it something that you were paid for at work? I think workers' compensation is probably going to apply. It's no different than, you have to drive to Des Moines for work. And you drive to Des Moines lots of times anyway. And if you get into a car accident, not even your fault, but somebody else's fault, you're going to have workers' compensation coverage because you're driving to Des Moines for work. And that's workers' compensation. So yes, I think there's potentially some liability issues, but I think most of your workers' compensation coverage would cover it.
Okay. The other question, or another question, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but if an employer is not requiring vaccinations or encouraging them, but they have employees who are going to get them, do they have to allow time off work for them to get the vaccine?
At this point, no. There's no requirement to allow time off for that. That's not something that you have to by law provide. I think it's a good idea to provide, because that's going to put, so if you're an employer with 50 employees and you have, 10 of them over age 65 and they can get an appointment, and as everybody knows, there's only so many appointments out there that you can take. And so maybe there's only an appointment Monday at 1 o'clock. that you can get, and it's smack in the middle of the day, and the
Mhm.
employee wants to take time off, you probably should give them the time off now. But that's a limited amount of time for them to go get the vaccine and come back to work.
Great. One other question, can an employee refuse an employer required COVID vaccination strictly based on the fact that the vaccine was fast tracked and they don't believe it is safe?
Generally, no. Generally, no, unless there's some other disability or religion it doesn't sound like a religious exemption. But is there a disability? Do they have anxiety? I mean, this would take a lot further going down the road. They have an anxiety condition. And because they have this anxiety condition, this vaccination is going to cause them major issues. I think we'd have to look a lot further as to what the specific notes, if they got a note from their doctor, that kind of thing, to see whether or not a disability analysis actually applies.
Finally, excuse me, can an employer tell other employees who has not been vaccinated?
No. This is just like any other medical information that you would receive from an employee. Needs to be kept in a separate location, only provided to those people that have a need to know that information. Usually it's human resources or a separate medical individual. Usually that's it. That's the only people that should have access to that information. You shouldn't be going out there and saying, hey, 7 of our employees, congrats to Mary, Sue, and Tom. They got their vaccines today. I assume a lot of people are already publishing that for themselves. I mean, it's all over social media. And if they want to, if those employees want to have it announced, you can certainly ask permission to give that information. But no, you can't just automatically say, Larry decided not to go and get his vaccination. Everybody encourage Larry. That would be a problem in disclosure of medical information.
Yes. And finally, one last question here before we wrap up. Can you touch just a little bit more on the emergency use authorization and how can it be required since the emergency use authorization at a federal level is saying no?
So right now, the FDA has only authorized these 3 vaccines for emergency use. Is there, though, a limitation? Does that mean you cannot require the vaccine just because it's emergency use? I think no. The law all allows employers to require vaccinations, and the FDA has authorized this vaccination, and therefore you can require it. Does it matter from that standpoint that it's emergency use? Probably not. But I will say that nearly every employer that I know of have taken that into account to not require it yet, mainly because it's not widely available yet. In 2 or 3 months, things might change. So even, for example, in those essential businesses that are already getting authorized for use of the vaccine, most employers have not yet required it because, hey, even though I'm not requiring my 100 employees to get it, I know most employers have taken a poll about that number. And so 60 or 70% of those employees are going to get it, but that means 30 or 40 other vaccines can be out there for the elderly and others. So we're trying to get enough out there so it's not as big of a problem throughout the entire country or the region, because the more people that get vaccinated, the better. Now, if come May or June, it's widely available and everybody can get the vaccine, or at least every adult can get the vaccine, will that change? It might. I think that's when we have to look at whether it's going to be more commonly required of employees at that point, because everybody can go get a vaccine. Just like when you get, every now and then the flu shot has, a shortage. You hear about it because there's a new strain of flu out there and they just didn't anticipate it. And then all of a sudden they start doing that. But generally, the flu vaccine is widely available for anybody that wants it. So healthcare providers nearly always require their employees to get the flu vaccine, subject to the religious or the disability exemption that we already talked about.
Well, Mikkie, thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate your providing chamber members this important information. And as a reminder to those listening in, a recording of this program will be posted on our website later today. And we'll also be sending out a survey afterwards, which will include Mikkie's contact information as well as her slide deck that she used today. So again, thank you for joining us for Business Briefs. And we always post information about upcoming business briefs on our website, or if you're on our e-newsletter list, we also publicize them there. So thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great day.